Red vs. Blue. This show has had more of an impact on me than any other. This I know for a fact. Not only do I adore it for its hilarious humor, I adore it for the way it pioneered the machinima genre of content, inspiring countless teenagers such as myself across the globe to kickstart their own creations, no matter how cringe they ended up being in hindsight.
Ugh! Just go tell the recruits about the canyon, okay?
Fine. Hey, fucktards. I have a mission for you.
That means we passed training, guys.
I cherish it for how it evolved into a show with lore perhaps more simultaneously ridiculous and beautiful than Halo itself. From two losers complaining about boredom to a gripping tale of a broken man doing everything he can to restore his late love. From five guys with Xboxes to a huge collaborative effort consisting of dozens of crew members. How fitting how the show's swan song is titled Restoration, mutually being an ode to the return of this plot point and the return of the original creators. This swan song is what I'll be reviewing today as I go through the stages of grief of losing my favorite series ever, of all time. This movie, originally meant to air as a final 7-episode 19th season, finally sees us return to the Reds and Blues, the show's main lovable misfits. This is after an almost 5-year to the day hiatus since 2019, as the show's latest season, which premiered a year later, functioned instead as more of a spin-off with new characters and practically new everything for that matter. Therefore, for a production that usually released seasons on a yearly basis, this was a long overdue return to form, especially for myself, who had found this show in 2019. Not only does this film retreat to its original protagonist, though, it retreats all the way back to its 13th entry, effectively retconning everything afterwards as simulations. This was likely due to both the original creator, Bernie Burns, wanting a fresh slate to continue his story, since the other seasons were crafted by other writers, and also the fact that these later seasons were more poorly received. I was, and still am, mixed on this. On one hand, I loved the retcon seasons. Well, most of them. Sure, they weren't as great as the earlier run, and it introduced some gods and mechanics somehow even becoming too wild for RVB, but they finally provided development for many characters that were simply begging for some, particularly the red team, as the blue team had always been more involved in the plot. On the other hand, though, Bernie does decide to give the Reds some satisfying development and focus in this final, a lot of it being an improvement over the retcon seasons, so at the end of the day, I can't say we lost that much due to the revert. Well, except for a lot of the new characters they introduced, which I will miss being officially canon. Particularly Temple, such an underrated villain for real. Although technically he should still be canon in some way, as his backstory still should have happened. There's also a few other characters who suffered from this alteration of canon, but I'll get to them when I start discussing characters. Before we can talk about characters, though, let's introduce the plot itself. It picks up a few months after the battle on Chorus. Tucker has gone missing, unknowingly to the rest of the gang, being possessed by Sigma, now played by Miles Luna, and the other AI fragments, including Theta, now played by Bernie's youngest son, Finn, after Epsilon's deconstruction, essentially becoming a new version of the meta, threatening the entire galaxy as they want to find Epsilon and become the Alpha. Thankfully, Epsilon foresaw this when he was deconstructing to help the Reds and Blues against Hargrove, so that's why he began running simulations such as the Shizno trilogy in order to find a way to stop Tucker, the Meta 2.0, who is mainly under the control of Sigma and his ambition. He eventually alerts the Reds and Blues of the Meta's return through recordings he left in Caboose's helmet, thus beginning the Reds and Blues' final quest to stop the AI once and for all. When I say the Reds and Blues, though, I unfortunately don't mean our whole group of Rainbow Soldiers. I really only mean Sarge, Griff, Simmons, and Caboose. While all of the others do appear in some form, they have much more minor roles in comparison to this quartet. Let's go more in depth on the characters, shall we? First, we'll talk about the characters with the most minor roles, which are unfortunately Sister and Donut. These are the characters I was referring to that got the most ass fucked by the retcon, having lost all of their growth without having a chance to replace it. Donut is mentioned to have become an admiral, but other than that, he only has a brief cameo in Simmons' imagination, so that means he doesn't even appear physically in the film. If you happen to miss his quick name drop, you could assume he dies on chorus. I assume either scheduling conflicts with Dan Godwin, Donut's voice actor, or runtime were the obvious obstacles here. It's likely the latter, though, as they could have recasted Donut if needed, as they did several other characters. I'm sure Bernie would have loved to give everyone their roses and violets, but unfortunately, it seems time didn't permit. Ironically, he was the one character you could write off if you kept the simulations as canon too, since he left the group in the end. At the end of the day, I just wish Donut could have at least retained his development, as he was the biggest shining star of the Shizno trilogy. Now for Sister. She does at least have a physical appearance in the film at the beginning, speaking at the opening of a new film based on the Reds and Blues being developed by Dylan Andrews. Side note, why not have Jax here as well? You could establish him as another director and still give us an interaction between this version of Dylan and Jax, revealing they at least still know each other. It would also still keep Jax's arc of becoming a director intact, even furthering it. By the way, Dylan also apparently dies right after this opening scene, so her character truly regressed. In addition to this, they had Matt Hullum's wife Anna replace her voice actor as well, adding a final nail to the coffin, literally, for Dylan. That's not to hate on Anna at all, and they were probably a stretch too thin on budget to get her OG actress. Anyways, back to Sister. While she wasn't as developed as Donut, what really suffers is her relationships with the rest of the characters. She now canonically hasn't even interacted with any of the Reds and Blues since Season 6, most notably Griffin Tucker. Interestingly as well, her actress was brought in to record lines with Tucker's actor, as per Jeff on the Anima podcast. Why have them record together when they don't even share any scenes, especially when I'm pretty sure they don't typically do that? At least Sister had a reason to be written off in this timeline as opposed to Donut. Now let's talk about Lopez. He doesn't really get messed up by the retcon, as he didn't gain much development to begin with, but he doesn't gain any here either. To be fair, I can't really think of anything you could do to develop Lopez aside from making him speak English for a bit.
Calling me private. You are not my superior. I am a robot. I am superior to all of you.
Which would only work as a bit. Interestingly, his last line that he says is in English, being merely shit in reaction to Epsilon's first message.
Shit.
Which I must mention must have been inspired by Season 15's Epsilon message, as they sound eerily similar. Regardless, it's not explained why he can suddenly speak English, but it shows that Bernie was open to it a little. I'll save my theory for why Lopez could now speak English lore-wise for later, though. Sorry for all the teases. I need to keep the engagement up. I think it's fine to leave some characters alone. He does at least interact with Caboose, assisting him with playing Epsilon's messages in the first act, but is mysteriously absent for the rest, even the ending at Blood Gulch. Does that mean he was just left at the random base? If so, at least he was left with Sheila, where they can romance all they want since Caboose isn't there with his jealous ass.
Oh yeah, I guess I should mention they brought Sheila back. I normally am against reviving dead characters, but there was really no reason not to. And technically Phyllis was still alive after the battle in the trophy room. It was only Sheila's original form that had died, so I'm fine with it.
I was really happy to see that they got
Yo Mary Cruz back to voice her, as I didn't know if they were still on good terms. Speaking of voice actors, Lopez was now voiced by Eddie Rivas, who had previously voiced him in non-canon content in 2021 and 2022. He does a perfectly suitable job. Lopez's voice being so robotic, as well as entirely in Spanish, makes his voice pretty easy to replicate. However, I question why they just didn't get Bernie back. He was writing the season anyway, and Lopez had so few lines he could have done the recording in one session. I think this is the perfect time to pivot to Caboose, whose recasting is certainly more controversial. He's now played by Michael Malconian due to Joel Heyman's firing in 2020. When I originally heard the new voice in the death battle, to be frank, it was rough. Caboose's voice was one of the most iconic and animated, so it was going to be tough on anyone to replace Joel. I'm happy to say Michael is vastly improved though, bringing his own uniqueness to the voice while still having hints of Joel. I've still been seeing hate from Michael online, so I just want to give my heartfelt thanks to him for trying his best. And to all of those said haters, would you rather him be recast or ignored entirely? As for the character itself, he is treated very well. While he doesn't get as much development as the Reds, he certainly had his moments to shine, not only being the conduit for Epsilon's recordings, but being the one to feed the Epsilon unit the memories it requires for the final battle against Sigma. I appreciate his relationship with Epsilon here as well, and how the ending features him being the one to destroy the Epsilon unit and the AIs for good, acting as a nice substitute for the goodbye scene in Season 15, as he reaches that same acceptance of death. The Season 15 scene had way more weight to it, of course, but at least we got something. Caboose also has a nice moment when he is almost killed by the Meta. That sounds twisted. Attempting to break Tucker from Sigma's control. For two people that had done some of the most bickering throughout the series, this was really sweet. One last nitpick relating to Caboose, though. Where the hell was Freckles? He could have easily shown up. He should have still been inside Caboose's gun, after all. Even one line would have sufficed. Speaking of Tucker, I'm both satisfied and disappointed with how he was done. He was very much in character for the screen time he did have, but being possessed until the very end severely limited the time we could spend with him, which I selfishly wanted more of, as he had been my most consistent favorite character. I can't be too mad, though, as Tucker was in need of development the least, so there was more pressing matters to attend to. And hey, we technically got to see him with his sword and back in the green metasuit. That's better than how Zero treated him. He does in addition get one scene that really stood out, which was when he was tortured by Gamma and Sigma for trying to break free, being put in a 10-year simulation of constant pain and torture. This was a great callback to Singularity's Labyrinth, as well as when Church was put through something similar in Season 3, officially confirming that it was a simulation after all these years. Most importantly regarding Tucker, though, he does get to say a variation of Bow Chicka Bow Wow one last time, with it even being the last line in the whole series, acting as a post-credit scene.
What are you doing here? The show's over. Red versus Blue is over. Get out of here. Bow Chicka Bye now.
Next up, let's talk about our main trio of Reds, starting off with Sarge. If you've seen the season, you already know his biggest moment. The chupa thingy in the room, if you will. His death. His motherfucking death. Bernie actually had the balls to kill someone off. I was hoping they would, to be honest, as I wanted true stakes for this last hurrah, and I was not disappointed. The death is caused by the Meta fatally stabbing him after he saves Caboose. This is so beautiful in and of itself, as it shows how even Sarge was able to put aside his hatred for the Blues, which he definitely still retains in his final moments, rest assured. What is even more beautiful, though, is his goodbye to Simmons and Griff. While yes, it is extremely unfortunate that the whole group wasn't there for his death, Lopez in particular, this scene almost compensated for it entirely. For one, Sarge encourages Simmons to become the leader in his stead, claiming he knew Simmons was ready for a while, and secondly, he actually compliments Griff. Not just an offhand statement either. This man gives a full-on speech about how he was only so hard on him because he believed in him all this time and wanted him to be the best he could be. It honestly rivals his revelation speech for me. It'll always be more iconic, but this proves that Bernie still has that magic touch with dialogue. I legitimately thought it was going to end with a just kidding though, as it sounded exactly like something he would say sarcastically to Griff. It took until the scene transitioned to the next before I believed it was actually genuine for once. I'm sure glad it was though. If they played Sarge's death off as a joke, it would not have gone over well. Sarge's final resting place ends up being Blood Gulch, where he is buried and given a funeral, once again only attended by Griffin Simmons. This was a great reference to the funeral in Season 5, and it draws a lot of parallels, though the circumstances are obviously very different. Sarge also lives on through a voice box type thing that says Sarge quotes, so that was a nice little detail. I think it would have been even nicer, though, if this was designed by Lopez. Even if they simply had Simmons mention this, it would confirm that Lopez wasn't forgotten, and at least inform him of his creator's death. Griff jokes about what Sarge's real name actually was, with Simmons confirming that he still couldn't find any records of his real name. While a part of me was hoping that it would be revealed, it's probably for the best it wasn't. I think it's one of those things where leaving it up to the viewer's interpretation is better, much like the Reds and Blues faces. Sarge also lives on through passing on his beloved shotgun to Simmons, which later gets destroyed in their last confrontation with the Meta, but it was another great little addition, which if there's one thing the movie excels at, it's great little additions and callbacks that don't feel too forced. I'm sure there's plenty I'm forgetting, and plenty I haven't picked up on, but here's just some of them that really stuck out to me.
Wash saying, "That's the best throw, ever, of all time." The teleporters from Blood Gulch and North's Dome Shield being in the chairman's room, Grog and Stu Stuntman, as well as people dressed as the triplets being mentioned in the beginning to be at Dylan's event. Carolina saying, "That nerd has a really good arm," when Simmons throws the capture unit at the Meta, although Donut should have been involved. Griff using the Griff shot again. There's plenty more, with a lot of the final battle mirroring earlier fights in the series and the return of the Protect Me cone joke, but it's hard to get into that without talking about the last act, which I'd like to save for the end. For now, let's discuss Griff and Simmons. I'm so happy to report that they were both done tremendously well here. Simmons actually got something, after 21 goddamn years. He and Lopez were the two characters who stayed stagnant virtually the entire time, and Simmons was finally remedied. As I mentioned earlier, he became the Red Team's leader, now officially being called Sir, though only by Griff, as they're the only two Reds still on the team at this point. This was a great direction to take Simmons' character, as he had always lived as the second in command or shadow of someone else, whether that be Sarge or his own father. Man, I'd like to see the look on his father's face now. While it does suck that we won't get to see Simmons lead the entire group, he probably still would have lost the title to Wash, Carolina, or Tucker anyway. It would definitely have been interesting to see Simmons argue for his own plan and veto Carolina's, though. To close off my thoughts on Simmons, I'll just say that I'm glad if anyone got development, it was him, even compared to someone like Donut, because even though Donut's development is now non-canon, at least there's content that exists at all where he's experienced growth. Griff didn't really have an obvious arc in the film per se, but he did have a lot of moments that resembled ones from the Shizno trilogy. For starters, he decides to both help out with Epsilon's initial plan, despite being against assisting him initially, and stays behind for the final fight even when Simmons permits him to leave. This is very reminiscent of his arc in Season 15, where he goes to save the Reds and Blues after also declining to help Epsilon. This alone essentially returned him back to his end of Singularity self, but Restoration elevates him even more with the ending they chose to give him. Next up, let's talk about the next two most prominent characters, Wash and Doc. These two are paired together for the entire film, bringing back a lot of memories from Season 8.
When I say paired together, I mean it, as without Wash, Doc would have had no role. This is because it is revealed that Doc died in the Battle of Chorus after healing Wash, leading this version of Doc to appear as a manifestation of his guilt. Wash is so severely fucked up by this guilt that I figured he somehow retained his brain damage from Shizno. As for the decision to kill Doc off screen, I despised the idea originally,
Almost as much as Caboose hates babies and taxes.
but now I'm starting to come around to it a bit, for multiple reasons. I still stand by that it was disrespectful to unceremoniously off him, but, to start, showing his death would also require showing the long, mysterious final battle on Chorus, which should be left to our imagination. Secondly, there's not a lot of characters that were particularly close to him, so I don't know if a big death scene actually would have been necessary. It would have been better than what we got, but at least Wash remembering him somewhat enhances his character, not being forgotten for once. That's more growth than dead characters usually get, to be fair. I definitely pictured him working alongside Dr. Gray on Chorus, though, and I'm sad we didn't get to see that.
As for Wash's arc itself, I really enjoyed it. I've seen some people say how they just wanted Wash to be happy and not struggle anymore. But that's what Zero did, reversing his brain injury, and everyone rightfully hated that. I think this season, finding a way to keep Wash in a similar position to how he was in Shizno, with Bernie confirming on the commentary that was the intention, was a really smart move. Also, unlike the Shizno trilogy, Restoration focuses more on how his trauma from the past regarding the freelancers affected him, which leads him to finally forgive himself for their deaths after some consoling from Carolina and visions of all the known dead freelancers. This was such a nice surprise, especially with the added bonuses of their characters using Halo 3 models and all retaining their original voice actors. The only speaking freelancer who doesn't keep their OG actress is 479er, who actually plays a decent-sized role, acting as the gang's pilot. I was extremely pleased, but also perplexed by this. It's never told to us where she's been or what she's been up to since Freelancer. All we know is that she was still in contact with Phyllis. It makes sense that she was alive at least due to the Season 15 retcon, but adding just a few more pieces of dialogue could have done wonders. Just another caveat of the runtime. Back to Wash. I wish Wash was more involved instead of being relegated to a subplot, but I'm happy with how they ended his character, along with Carolina's for that matter. Her role is a lot smaller, only showing up for the final battle when Wash activates his emergency beacon. It's unclear why she was absent and what else she was up to. I would assume she would be the one to watch over Wash in the hospital, but the only one who does so is Dr. Gray. Seriously though, Dr. Gray but no Palomo? Come on, Bernie. The ending may imply she still works with some form of the Alliance of Defense from Zero, but that's merely an assumption. Talking about the ending is now unavoidable if I want to finish the rest of this review, so let's not put it off anymore and advance to the final battle. Following Sarge's death and the Reds and Blues return to Blood Gulch, Caboose explains the plan to bring Church back, referencing the iconic line that memories are the key, leading Griffin Simmons to join him in remembering all of their past adventures while a new Bare Naked Ladies song plays in the background. I initially thought this song was very out of place, but when I realized who sang it, it fit in better than the last puzzle piece. If you don't know, Freelancer Florida, aka Butch Flowers, was played by their lead singer, Ed Robertson, in the early seasons, and according to the commentary, he had sent Rooster Teeth his new album to use. How ironic that the budget was too small to get the show's main composers, Trocadero, but could utilize a song from Bare Naked Ladies. Anyways, this campfire scene of flashbacks was beautiful, as it's the only time we actually get to see all the Reds and Blues together, even if it's not in the present. The next morning, Meta arrives, kicking the shit out of Griffin Simmons. Thankfully, Caboose's plan from the night before had worked, meaning that Church was back once again. Psych! Caboose chose to disobey Epsilon's instructions, instead reviving none other than Tex, much to my initial dismay. Tex's send-off was pure perfection, and I did not trust anyone to extend her arc, even Bernie. I've never been more pleased to be wrong, though, as they treated her beautifully. She's voiced by Kathleen, something not achievable since 2014 due to her falling out with Rooster Teeth. This makes me wonder if they did actually try to get Joel back as Caboose. I assumed they would have went straight for Michael, as Joel likely would have requested huge funds, but I guess we'll never know. The important thing is that Tex is back, and she fights the meta in a fight that clearly mirrors Monty's from Season 8, both Tex vs. the Reds and Tex vs. Meta. Not nearly the same level of animation, but the same soul is there 100%. She even sports her iconic black armor, changing from Church's blue one when Tex emerges through the teleporter during the fight. A fun fact is that this detail was only added by the Machinimators after the script was written, more evidence of the passion that went into this. Anyways, even she is struggling to beat the meta, even with Carolina's help, who had entered the fray at this point, and is eventually pinned by the meta, who reminds her of the fact that she was always supposed to fail. However, Tex clarified that she doesn't have to fail anymore, being based on the memories of the Reds and Blues this time, as opposed to the director. This was such a full circle moment, probably one of my favorites. This certainly seems like the special that was described by Sean Hines in 2022 that was supposed to wrap up old plot threads, especially with Matt starting production on it as early as 2022, as that's a plot thread right there. The battle ends as Simmons gets one last moment to shine, throwing the capture unit to Tex, allowing her to trap the meta and all of its AI inside, including herself, as she meets up with Epsilon, who doesn't recognize her just like before. This scene was virtually identical to when the meta trapped Tex in Season 8, and was apparently animated in only a week. If so, that's pretty impressive. To address the animation overall, it was certainly janky in a lot of spots, but you know what? I don't care. It was good enough when it needed to be, and I was just happy to return to majority machinima. If you're gonna be hung up on the animation now, go watch Zero. That way, it can be useful for something. And so, Red vs. Blue comes to a close with the meta defeated and Tucker restored. I have to admit, after watching the prologue probably over 1,000 times in the lead up to this season, I kind of expected Sigma himself to actually do more, or at least have a bit more of a motivation. He wants to become metastable, but what were his plans afterwards? Epsilon's animated graphics mention the alien prophecy and the Great Destroyer, and I wish that was expanded upon more. As much as I loved the meta being a mindless monster, I would have preferred if Sigma's cunning shined through a bit more. Bernie even admits in the commentary that this version of the meta was somewhat inspired by Zero with how overpowered and over the top he is. Not that I'm even remotely claiming that this meta is on the same level writing-wise. Hell, even Gankins' is floors above Zero. However, I can't deny that Zero and Sigma do share some similarities here. With Tucker back to normal, and the Epsilon unit destroyed for good, Simmons gives Griff his first and final official order, which is to get the fuck out of Blood Gulch, officially discharging him. This is the perfect send-off to Griff's character in my opinion, as he finally gets what he wanted after all these years. While it is heart-shattering to see our duo of Grimmons finally split up, there's nothing stopping Griff from returning if he really wants. The final scene features a Pelican arrive to pick up Griff as him and Simmons discuss why they were here one last time, with Griff simply responding that he never figured it out, but was glad everyone was there with him, including the Blues, who he admits turned out not to be bad dudes. On top of all that, Valdea by Trocadero plays in the background, also acting as the credits music just as it did in Season 1. I would have loved to hear Blood Gulch Blues one more time, but was more than satisfied with this choice as well. The somber but accepting mood fits the scene way better anyway. I'm just relieved Trocadero was put in the score in some way, even if there were no new tracks. I should also mention how Agent 1 from Zero was the one piloting Griff's Pelican. This is what I meant when I suggested that Carolina could have been working for the Alliance of Defense, even if they weren't the exact same as their Zero counterpart. I'm somewhat shocked Fiona agreed to come back after her drama with RBB fans, but I'm happy they threw in a Zero reference somewhere. Regardless of my feelings towards it, its crew, a lot of whom worked on this movie, deserve to have their work acknowledged, even with it now sort of non-canon. I say sort of, bringing me to my last major topic, the nature of the simulations. Do you recall how I said Lopez could speak English and had a new voice actor despite Bernie being available? Well, I, along with many others in the RVB fandom, believe this to be intentional. Perhaps these not-so-subtle differences are indicating that restoration itself is also a simulation. We already know that people's voices being different is a potential side effect of the simulations, as noted by Epsilon when talking about how he sometimes got Caboose's voice wrong, which Caboose's voice also is here. Bernie also mentioned in the commentary that he wanted people to be able to pick and choose what things they liked best from the later seasons to create their own ending, citing restoration as the ending he wanted, intentionally leaving it open-ended for fans to build on with fanfiction. Restoration being a simulation would correspond to this, since it would mean that nothing was set in stone. I'm usually not a fan of leaving things up to the audience, but I think it works in RVB's case. The show, having so many different creatives throughout the years, has always been meant as a sandbox for different writers, with Season 14 especially being a prime example. In fact, Season 14 ended with Vic echoing Bernie's sentiment, encouraging fans to create their own stories. This proves that this was always Bernie's plan. Sure, he had his idea for Season 15, which essentially turned into restoration, but he clearly knew how creative the fans could be, and he was right. There's currently so many RVB fan projects in the works. We have Crash, Avalanche, everything Quantum Star Productions is cooking up. Hey, if you guys need a voice actor or maybe even a writer, I may be down. And all made purely out of love for Red vs. Blue and its legacy, which even if restoration was truly the end, and no one ends up buying the IP, will last forever, just like memories. Hey guys, thanks for watching this review. I hope it was well organized. In the description, you'll find links to all the fan series I mentioned. Go check them out. Also, since I know the commentary isn't available on every site, here's some more highlights from it. The budget was in fact very low. That's not an assumption. We have official confirmation that they were basically penny pinchers, which is a great reference to the PSA of the same name, although it is massively unfortunate, obviously. As if it wasn't obvious, Bernie did want to write a story for the Reds, acknowledging what I pointed out about the Blues always being at the center of attention. Hell, it's not just what I've pointed out, it's what everybody's pointed out. But once again, good to see that Bernie knew that the Reds needed some focus, especially with the Redcon. In tandem with the lower budget, they were also working with a smaller crew, with the season's crew being the smallest since Season 8. In addition to this, the crew didn't meet until the last 4 months of production in person. Blood Gulch was both machinimated and animated at multiple parts in the movie, so it was a hybrid, and they explained that a lot of the scenes were like that, so I feel like that could explain why the movie looks so odd at certain places. It doesn't look bad in a lot of the shots, just it looks very uncanny. The goal of restoration was to restore the core story of RVB. While Bernie unfortunately didn't elaborate on where 479er was during the course of the series or anything like that, he did mention simply wanting to put her in as she was the most liked character with the least amount of screen time, comparing her to Boba Fett. There was 2 deleted scenes included. One featuring Simmons being able to see Griff's search history. Which, as you can see, the description also mentions that this deleted scene could take place in another timeline, which is another hint towards there being a whole bunch of other simulations and everything potentially being a simulation in another timeline. The other deleted scene was gonna feature Jack as his guard that he played all the way back in season 9, and he was going to be essentially returning for the scene that was a reference to the COVID pandemic with all the other security guards that were voiced by other RT employees like Barbara Dunkelman, Blaine Gibson, Armando. Basically, Jack was going to return for that scene as a guard that we had seen previously in the series. So I do wish that we saw this scene in the actual movie. Speaking of the security guard scene, though, it was apparently written all the way back in early 2023, which still feels like it was written too soon. This feels like this scene should have been written in like 2020. Sarge originally had dialogue during his death talking about how it wasn't the Blues' fault they were so bad because they didn't have a leader. The campfire scene with the flashback was meant to homage season 15, and I assume this was the Biff and Temple scene when they were outside in the desert, which I definitely thought of when I originally watched the scene. Simmons was indeed intended to be the main character, and an Easter egg that even I missed was Wash falling off of the cliff in Restoration was a throwback to Relocated when Griff was on the tower. Lastly, Season 6 and Season 8 were two seasons that they went back on heavily when writing and directing, which you can definitely see in the final product. And that is officially the end of my Red vs. Blue Restoration review. I hope you guys enjoyed, and I would just like to say a massive thank you to Bernie for ending the show off. Even though I have my issues with this season, it was far from perfect. Thank you so much for coming back one last time.